You think Alice in Wonderland is just a whimsical children's story? Developmental psychologists have discovered something profound hidden within Lewis Carroll's narrative. When researchers analyzed the psychological structure of Alice's journey, they found it wasn't fantasy. It was an extraordinarily accurate portrayal of how children's consciousness actually operates when confronting the adult world. The seemingly absurd elements aren't random creativity. They're precise representations of cognitive experiences that every child navigates during development. The most remarkable part? Carroll, whether consciously or unconsciously, created a narrative that maps directly onto documented stages of childhood psychological development, particularly around identity formation, reality testing, and the collision between child logic and adult authority. This isn't about hidden symbols or drug references. This is about how a 19th century mathematician captured the genuine psychological experience of childhood consciousness, encountering systems it doesn't yet understand. And examining what Alice's journey reveals exposes universal truths about how developing consciousness makes sense of confusing, contradictory reality. Not every interpretation of Alice in Wonderland is equally valid. There's a critical difference between legitimate psychological analysis based on developmental research and wild speculation projecting adult concerns onto a children's story. Scholars and psychologists have noted that some interpretations, particularly Freudian sexual readings or drug allegory claims, reveal more about the interpreter's preoccupations than about Carroll's actual narrative or childhood psychology. But developmental psychologists examining the story through the lens of how children actually think, process identity, and experience authority have found remarkable correspondence between Alice's experiences and documented patterns in child development. The absurdity that adults find entertaining is often precisely how children experience adult rules and social systems: arbitrary, contradictory, and confusing. What appears as fantasy from adult perspective often reflects genuine childhood cognitive experience. Real psychological analysis distinguishes between projection and recognition, between reading adult concerns into the text and identifying authentic representations of childhood consciousness that research validates. In this video, I'm going to reveal what developmental psychology, consciousness research, and literary analysis show about what Alice in Wonderland actually captures regarding childhood mental experience. You'll discover how Alice's journey mirrors documented stages of identity development, why the story's logic reflects genuine child cognition, and what psychologists recognize in the narrative about how children process reality, authority, and selfhood. These are insights from developmental psychology, cognitive science, and literary scholarship about what makes Alice such an enduring psychological portrait. By the end, you'll understand why psychologists consider this one of the most accurate literary representations of childhood consciousness ever created. This isn't a video claiming hidden meanings or drug references in Alice in Wonderland. This is examining what developmental psychology recognizes in the narrative about actual childhood cognitive and emotional experience. This video is for people interested in child development, consciousness studies, or understanding what makes certain literature psychologically resonant across generations. If you wonder why Alice's story feels so psychologically true despite its absurdity, or what the narrative reveals about how children think, you're about to discover what researchers have identified. If you're ready to understand the real psychology behind one of literature's most famous childhood journeys, keep watching. Think about the opening of Alice's story. She's bored with her sister's book that has no pictures or conversations, and she's considering making a daisy chain when she sees the white rabbit. The seemingly simple setup captures something psychologists recognize. Children's consciousness operates differently from adults. Children need visual stimulation and dialogue. Abstract text without images or interaction doesn't engage their developing minds. They're absorbed in immediate sensory experience, making daisy chains, watching insects. Then something unusual captures attention completely, and they follow impulsively without considering consequences. This isn't poor decision-making. It's how child consciousness functions. Developmental psychologists document that children have different attentional systems, different impulse control, different risk assessment than adults. Alice's decision to follow the rabbit down the hole without hesitation isn't character flaw. It's accurate representation of how children's consciousness responds to novelty and curiosity without adult risk calculation systems fully developed. The psychological weight of Carroll's opening is that he immediately established we're in child consciousness, operating by its rules rather than adult logic. Everything that follows makes sense from that developmental perspective, even when it seems absurd from an adult viewpoint. Developmental psychology provides a framework for understanding what Alice's journey represents psychologically. The psychologist Jean Piaget documented stages of cognitive development, identifying that children progress through qualitatively different ways of thinking. Young children are in what he called pre-operational stage. They're developing symbolic thought, but haven't yet developed logical operations that characterize adult thinking. They engage in magical thinking, have difficulty with conservation and reversibility, and center on one aspect of situations while ignoring others. Alice's age in the story, approximately 7, places her right at the transition between pre-operational and concrete operational thinking. She's developing logical capacity but still operates partly in magical thinking mode. This explains why she can accept the impossibilities of Wonderland while also trying to apply logic to them. She questions whether she's still herself after changing size, tries to remember her lessons, and attempts to apply rules, all concrete operational thinking. But she also accepts talking animals, magical potions, and impossible situations, pre-operational acceptance of magic. Carol captured consciousness in transition between developmental stages. The psychologist Erik Erikson documented stages of identity development, identifying that children around Alice's age are working on what he called industry versus inferiority, developing sense of competence and identity. Alice's repeated questioning of who she is after changing size. I wonder if I've been changed in the night? Let me think. Was I the same when I got up this morning? I almost think I can remember feeling a little different. Directly reflects the identity questions children actually grapple with during development. Am I still me if my body changes? What makes me who I am? These aren't abstract philosophical questions for children. They're urgent psychological concerns as they develop self-concept. The psychiatrist Donald Winnicott studied how children use imagination and play to process reality, calling it transitional space, where they work out psychological challenges. Wonderland functions precisely as transitional space. Alice processes her confusion about adult rules, her developing identity, and her frustrations with authority through imaginative journey where normal rules don't apply. She can challenge the queen, question the caterpillar, and resist the adults trying to control her in ways she couldn't in Victorian reality. The psychologist Alison Gopnik studied childhood consciousness and found that children experience what she calls lantern consciousness, diffuse awareness of everything simultaneously rather than adult spotlight consciousness that focuses selectively. Alice's experience in Wonderland reflects this. She's equally attentive to everything strange happening around her without adult filtering of what's important versus irrelevant. Everything in Wonderland gets equal attention because that's how child consciousness processes novel environments. The literary scholar and psychologist Humphrey Carpenter analyzed Victorian children's literature and documented that Carol was unusual in representing childhood consciousness accurately rather than imposing adult morality onto child characters. Most Victorian children's literature was didactic, teaching proper behavior through stories. Carol instead represented how children actually think, creating psychological authenticity that made Alice endure when more moralistic stories were forgotten. Insider knowledge from developmental psychology reveals that Wonderland isn't just fantasy. It's externalization of internal experience of childhood consciousness navigating confusing adult world. But here's what specific elements of Alice's journey reveal about child psychology when examined through developmental research. The size changes Alice experiences throughout the story aren't just plot devices. They represent genuine psychological experience of childhood. Children's relationship with their bodies is unstable as they grow rapidly. They feel too small in adult spaces, then awkwardly too large in child spaces. They literally don't fit. Chairs are wrong size, tables too high or too low. Clothes constantly need replacing. Alice's distress at changing size unpredictably. I'm sure I'm not Ada, for her hair goes in such long ringlets, and mine doesn't go in ringlets at all, and I'm sure I can't be Mabel, for I know all sorts of things, and she knows such a very little. Reflects children's actual confusion about identity as their bodies change. Who am I if my physical form keeps changing? Children genuinely struggle with this during rapid growth periods. The tears Alice cries that become a pool represent emotional dysregulation. Children's emotions are intense and can quickly overwhelm them. One moment crying, the next swimming in the tears. Their emotional regulation systems are still developing, so feelings flood consciousness in ways they can't modulate. Alice's experience of nearly drowning in her own tears captures a psychological reality, emotions that feel overwhelming and dangerous, that you cause but can't control. The encounters with authority figures, the caterpillar, the duchess, the queen, represent child experience of adult authority as arbitrary and confusing. The caterpillar asks, "Who are you?" when Alice doesn't know, then criticizes her answers. The duchess's household operates by violent, contradictory rules. The queen orders executions for minor infractions. From adult perspective, these are absurd exaggerations. From child perspective, they're accurate representations of how adult authority often appears. Arbitrary, disproportionate, and incomprehensible. Why do adults get angry about things that seem unimportant? Why do rules apply sometimes but not others? Children experience adult authority systems as Wonderland-like, senseless and threatening. The Mad Tea Party represents something developmental psychologists recognize: children's experience of adult social rituals as confusing performance following arbitrary rules. The Tea Party has elaborate etiquette: when to move seats, how to ask questions, what's polite, but the rules make no sense and keep changing. This is precisely how children experience adult social occasions. Why do we have to sit still? Why can't we say what we think? Why do adults talk about boring things using complicated words? The Mad Hatter and March Hare's conversation, full of riddles, wordplay, and logic that goes nowhere, mirrors how adult conversations sound to children who don't have the context or knowledge to follow it. They're excluded from understanding, but expect to participate anyway. Alice's frustration, "I don't think," "Then you shouldn't talk," said the Hatter, captures children's experience of being silenced by adults who don't want their logic questioned. The trial at the end represents child experience of justice systems that claim to be fair but operate by rules the child can't understand or challenge. The queen declares sentence first, verdict afterwards, which sounds absurd but reflects how children often experience punishment. They're in trouble before they understand what they did wrong, and explanations come after consequences. The trial's witnesses give irrelevant testimony. Evidence makes no sense, and the whole proceeding is predetermined. Children experiencing adult disciplinary systems, school punishments, parental rules, social consequences, often feel exactly this way. The system claims to be fair, but the outcome seems decided regardless of what actually happened. Alice's final rebellion, "You're nothing but a pack of cards," represents developmental moment when children recognize that adult authority systems are constructed rather than natural, that the rules and hierarchies are made up by people rather than being inevitable truths. This recognition is a crucial step in identity development and critical thinking. The transformation that occurs when you understand Alice's journey as psychological representation of childhood consciousness is recognizing that the story's enduring power comes from its accuracy rather than its fantasy. Remember experiencing the story as resonant in ways you couldn't articulate? Understanding the developmental psychology reveals why. Carol captured genuine cognitive and emotional experiences of childhood, making the story feel true despite its impossibility. Your recognition of the story's truthfulness reflects recognition of your own childhood experience in Alice's journey. The confusion about identity, the arbitrary authority, the overwhelming emotions, the social rules that make no sense. You lived through these developmental challenges, and Alice's externalized journey through Wonderland represents the internal journey every child navigates. Understanding this transforms how you interpret the story. It's not escape from reality, but representation of a particular reality, childhood consciousness. It also transforms how you understand children currently in your life. When they seem to be operating by different logic, when they ask identity questions that seem obvious to you, when they're overwhelmed by emotions or confused by rules you find simple, they're navigating Wonderland. They're in genuinely different cognitive and emotional state than adults, and what seems absurd or difficult to you is their actual experience. Alice's story creates empathy bridge between adult consciousness and childhood consciousness by making child experience visible to adults who've forgotten what it felt like to think and feel that way. Even your understanding of your own psychological patterns can shift. Many adults struggles with identity, with authority, with emotional regulation have roots in childhood experiences of the challenges Alice faces. Understanding that these are normal developmental challenges rather than personal deficits can reduce shame and increase self-compassion. Now, here's where the psychological analysis becomes practically valuable rather than just interesting literary interpretation. Understanding what Alice's journey reveals about child psychology provides specific insights for anyone working with or raising children. First, children's irrationality often isn't deficiency. It's different developmental stage with its own logic. When children ask questions like, "Am I still me?" or struggle with concepts adults find obvious, they're doing genuine cognitive work of development. These questions deserve serious engagement rather than dismissal. Second, emotional intensity in children isn't manipulation or drama. It's real experience of consciousness that hasn't developed regulation capacity. When children are overwhelmed by feelings, they're genuinely drowning in their own tears like Alice. They need support developing regulation rather than criticism for having intense emotions. Third, children's difficulty with arbitrary rules isn't defiance. It's accurate perception that many rules don't make sense from their developmental perspective. Explaining why rules exist rather than just enforcing them helps children develop understanding rather than just compliance. Fourth, children need space to question and challenge in age-appropriate ways. Alice's final rebellion, recognizing that the authority figures are nothing but a pack of cards, is a healthy developmental step. Children need to learn to think critically about authority rather than accepting it blindly. Fifth, imaginative play isn't escape from learning. It's how children process reality and work out psychological challenges. Wonderland-type imaginative spaces allow children to practice skills, process emotions, and develop identity and safety before applying these in reality. Here's what examining Alice through developmental psychology ultimately reveals about the relationship between literature and consciousness. The stories that endure across generations often do so because they capture genuine psychological truths, even when authors weren't consciously aware of the psychology they were representing. Carroll wasn't trained in developmental psychology. It barely existed as field when he wrote Alice. But whether through observation, imagination, or his own retained access to childhood consciousness, he created a narrative that maps precisely onto what research would later document about how children actually think and feel. This is the power of literature. It can represent psychological realities that formal psychology hasn't yet articulated, preserving insights about consciousness that later research validates. Alice in Wonderland endures not just as entertainment, but as psychological document, one of the most accurate literary representations of childhood consciousness ever created. It allows adults to remember what it felt like to think like children, and it allows children to see their confusing experience reflected and validated. The psychological resonance is why the story remains powerful 150 years after publication. It represents timeless truths about developmental experience that remain constant across cultural changes. Every generation of children still faces the challenges Alice navigates, developing identity while body and mind are changing, confronting authority systems that seem arbitrary, managing overwhelming emotions, try to make sense of adult rules and social rituals that follow logic they haven't yet learned. And every generation of adults can use Alice as a reminder of what childhood consciousness actually involves: the confusion, the intensity, the different logic, creating empathy and understanding that supports healthier development. If you're a parent, teacher, or anyone working with children, Alice's journey provides a psychological map of what children are navigating internally even when external behavior seems inexplicable. If you're an adult working on your own psychological development, Alice's journey illuminates childhood experiences that shaped you, helping you understand patterns that originated in those developmental challenges. In the next video, I'm going to reveal what other classic children's literature reveals about psychology, which stories capture genuine developmental truths, and what those truths are, and how understanding the psychology in children's literature improves both our understanding of childhood and our ability to support healthy development. Until then, revisit Alice's journey with awareness of the developmental psychology it represents, and notice how differently you experience the story when you recognize it as psychological accuracy rather than mere fantasy. Subscribe if you want to understand how literature preserves psychological insights that formal research later validates, and how classic stories reveal truths about consciousness and development that remain constant across time.